What's up, y'all? Today I'm back with another video, and in this video I'm going to be talking about the topic of Jesus as our high priest and why his priesthood was greater than the priesthood of the Old Testament, more specifically the Old Covenant. A book of the Bible that helps build up on this idea of Jesus as a high priest and helps expand our knowledge on it is none other than the book of Hebrews. Specifically, I'll be jumping into Hebrews 7 and 8, where it talks about Melchizedek. I think that's how you say it. I'm not 100% sure. And then it talks about Jesus with our new covenant. So let us jump in. Hebrews 7 begins with a priest back in the Old Testament named Melchizedek. And he was around Abraham's time. He was a mysterious priest who came around with Abraham during the battles, and Abraham tithed 10%, a tenth of everything. So 10%. I'm pretty sure it's what it means. But continuing, Melchizedek's name meant king of righteousness and king of Salem, which also means king of peace. It is important to see that righteousness comes before peace. This is going to be a little bit more important in a minute. Now, the thing is, Melchizedek was not part of the lineage of Aaron. And priests back in the Old Covenant, priests back in the Old Testament had to be from the lineage of Aaron. You have to be a Levite to be a priest. Melchizedek did not meet that requirement. There isn't really much known about really who he really is lineage wise, because it mentions in 7:3, without father or mother, without genealogy, without beginning of days or end of life, resembling the Son of God, he remains a priest forever. We really do not know his lineage. We can just look at the fact that he is a priest. And another thing we can look at in verse 3, now some different versions may say made like, mine says resembling, but in Greek this word is called aphomeomenos, and this word in the active means a copy or model, and in the passive means being made similar to. It is, Melchizedek is not like Jesus. That is not what I am trying to say. Many commentators do argue with the idea that Jesus is not Melchizedek, or Melchizedek is not Jesus. Melchizedek, though, was a foreshadow of Jesus' eternal priesthood, one that combined righteousness and peace and paralleled Jesus' divine nature. The author of Hebrews then follows to expand on the idea of Jesus' priesthood. Verse 16, which reads, "One who has become a priest not on the basis of a regulation as to his ancestry, but on the basis of the power of an indestructible life." God is an indestructible life, and this means that God is eternal, he is limitless, and his nature is unchangeable. By limitless, it means that he has no limits put on him. He can do whatever he so pleases with whatever willpower he wants, because he has created everything. He is the ruler of the earth, and his nature does not change. His nature is constant throughout the entire Bible, and you can see a part where God could have easily changed his nature and poured out wrath onto the Israelites and just wiped them off the face of the earth. But no, he knew to keep his covenant that he has kept with Abraham and Noah, and did not wipe out the people of Israel. For those would be the descendants of Abraham, and God had promised Noah to not wipe anyone else out. But instead of wiping people out, he sent his son to wipe the sin out of people. We can also see that Jesus's ministry, his priesthood, was not based on human nature, but it was based on God's attributes of his indestructible life. Now, in knowing this, we can have hope in Jesus and not the law. It mentions in verse 18, the former regulation is set aside because it was weak and useless. For the law made nothing perfect, and a better hope is introduced by which we draw near to God. What is very important to look in this is that the law in the Old Covenant was weak and useless. The law set God's standard but could not keep it. It diagnosed our sin, it diagnosed our problem, but it could not cure it. Jesus, on the other hand, was that better hope that was introduced. It wiped away all of our sin. Jesus diagnoses our sin, but even further, he cured our sin. He cured the problem that separated us from God. The veil has been torn from top to bottom, so that we may have access to God at all times. Another thing to note in the Old Covenant, with the Old Covenant, they would sacrifice animals repeatedly to cleanse someone's sins outwardly. Sin was internal, but the old covenant cleansed outwardly. That because they believe that appearance is really what had mattered. Jesus, we are cleansed inwardly. We do not have to worry about ourselves exteriorly, because in the old covenant they believe presenting themselves to God as perfect outwardly is what had mattered. Like their sacrifices would matter, which is why it expands later in Hebrews, if I'm correct, 11. It mentions Cain and Abel. Abel's sacrifice was more pleasing to God's eyes because Abel had his faith, his heart put behind it. Cain's was just a sacrifice. Like, this animal looks good enough, God will be pleased with it. God looks for the worship of our heart. He does not care about external, because God truly looks at the heart. Because if your heart is in the right posture, it shows God that you're being intentional with your worship towards him. And it is a very, very important thing to know. Let's jump to verses 24 through 25, which read, But because Jesus lives forever, he has a permanent priesthood. Therefore, he is able to save completely those who come to God through him, because he always lives to intercede for them. Now, Jesus' ministry on earth is complete. But Jesus is now moved into his priesthood and his heavenly ministry, which is to defend us and intercede for us to the Father. And this intercession happens when we want to come to God with our heart, and with our heart that has the intent to want to be saved, to want to be cleansed and receive salvation. Because it's one thing to just go to church and look like, a regular churchgoer, but it's another thing to go and come to God. Jump down to verse 28. It mentions in verse 28, for the law appoints as high priests men in all their weaknesses, but the oath which came after the law appointed the Son, who has been made perfect forever. Back in the old covenant, back with the Mosaic law appointed priests, but these high priests were temporary. They were imperfect with human weaknesses, like I mentioned earlier. Here's the thing about Jesus, though. Jesus came down to experience those weaknesses and struggles. Jesus was human too. You see, Jesus wept. Jesus was stressing so highly that he was bleeding, which is a known scientific fact. Those are just two examples, and you can also see Jesus' weariness and him being tired at times, like with the good Samaritan woman. That's what I was trying to get. The Samaritan woman, it mentioned Jesus was tired. Now that we have those examples down, we can see that because Jesus was human, because Jesus went and encountered these different temptations, he can personally relate to us and help us fight these temptations Satan has sent at us. Like he mentions in 4:15, for we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. The high priest under the Mosaic law could only help them cover their sins temporarily for the moment. Just cover their sins and sacrifice. Your sins have been covered. You're good. Go on your way. Because these high priests also sinned. They also had their own weaknesses, so they could not sympathize with one another. The only thing the high priests could really do is just do the job they have been told to do. High priests were meant to be more externally cleaner than those who are not Levites. Like I mentioned earlier, in the old covenant they needed continual replacement for these high priests, but in the new covenant, because of Jesus' blood shed on the cross, we do not need a newer high priest every single time, because Jesus came in as not only a priest but also as the sacrifice. He just came down to do his priesthood here on earth, and Jesus knew to help people not only cover their sins but take their sins away, he had to be that sacrifice, because he was perfect, and he was the perfect sacrifice to go hang up on that cross and die for the sins of every man, every woman, and every child. Let's shift to Hebrews chapter 8. Now it mentions that high priest serve at a sanctuary that is a copy and shadow of what is in heaven, and it mentions the tabernacle. Now here's something interesting about the tabernacle. Within the tabernacle, there were no seats for high priests to sit on, because their work was not finished. The high priests were constantly offering sacrifices. They were continually doing work day in and day out. But the thing is about Jesus, on the other hand, Jesus, as it mentions in verse 1, who sat down at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven, and who serves in the sanctuary, the true tabernacle set up by the Lord, not by a mere human being. The work has been finished. Jesus can sit down and rest. Jesus still continues his priesthood, but Jesus can rest because the work has been finished. Jesus has dictated the terms of the new covenant to us. It is just up to us to either accept or reject. I'm going to end the video here and just leave you guys with this. Everything within the old covenant were steps in God's redemptive plan, and Jesus' death was the fulfillment of the old covenant, which now has established the new covenant. I appreciate y'all for tuning in, watching the video. If you watch all the way, leave a like, comment, subscribe, and I'll definitely keep the content rolling. But if you guys enjoy it, the rest of y'all stay blessed.